November 20th, 1943. 06, 23 hours. Red Beach 2, Baishio Island, Tarawa Atoll. The sand erupts in a pattern Japanese defenders have never witnessed before. Evenly spaced impacts walking directly toward their concealed positions with mechanical regularity. Through the firing slit of a palm log bunker, Japanese naval infantry watch Marine First Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins crawl forward carrying what looks, at a glance, like an oversized rifle. The Japanese infantry manual in use that morning had been written in 1909 and had not been substantially revised since. It devoted 17 pages to seishin, spiritual power, and the doctrine of the bayonet charge. It devoted 2 paragraphs to automatic weapons. The manual's underlying premise, taught at the Army Infantry School in Chiba as established military science rather than as morale-building rhetoric, held that a sufficiently motivated Japanese soldier possessed the fighting power of 3 Chinese soldiers or 2 Russian soldiers by spiritual superiority alone. This was not a metaphor officers used to encourage recruits. It was a formal teaching with a specific numerical ratio presented in the same classroom and with the same institutional authority as instruction on rifle maintenance or map reading. The doctrine had real historical grounding, which is part of why it survived so long unchallenged. Japanese infantry tactics, refined against Chinese forces in Manchuria and tested successfully against Russia at Port Arthur and Mukden decades earlier, had repeatedly demonstrated that aggressive infantry assault, pressed with sufficient determination, could overcome numerically superior but less motivated opposition. The doctrine was not invented from nothing. It was extrapolated from a genuine pattern of historical success, and then frozen in place. Taught unchanged through 3.5 decades in which the weapons available to a defending infantry squad had changed beyond recognition. Hawkins's weapon was a Browning automatic rifle, 19 pounds unloaded, chambered for the .30-06 Springfield round, capable of firing at a slow cyclic rate of 300 to 450 rounds per minute, or a fast rate of 500 to 650. A 20-round magazine could be emptied in under 3 seconds on the fast setting. In the next 20 minutes, Hawkins's scout sniper platoon would clear 3 Japanese strongpoints using concentrated BAR fire. And the battle for Tarawa, which would end with 4,500 Japanese defenders dead in 76 hours, had effectively already declared its character. The weapon itself dated to 1917, designed by John Moses Browning specifically in response to a request from the American Expeditionary Forces commanders, who had observed French and British infantry struggling against the same problem that would later confront Japan. Bolt-action rifles simply could not generate the sustained volume of fire that trench warfare demanded at the individual soldier level. Browning's design, gas-operated, selective between automatic and semi-automatic fire, light enough for one man to carry and operate without a dedicated crew, arrived too late for extensive combat use in the First World War itself. But the basic mechanism required almost no fundamental redesign across the following quarter century. What changed between 1918 and 1943 was not the weapon. It was the doctrine governing how many of them a given army was willing and able to put into the hands of ordinary infantrymen, and the industrial capacity to manufacture them at the resulting scale. This is the story of why Japan's military establishment never developed an effective answer to that weapon, despite 3 years and 5 major island battles in which to do so. The answer is not a story about courage versus cowardice. It is a story about what happens when a military culture's deepest theoretical commitments turn out to be empirically false at exactly the moment those commitments are tested against an opponent who never shared them. The Imperial Japanese Army was not unaware of automatic weapons in 1941. It fielded its own light machine guns, the Type 96, of which roughly 41,000 were produced during the war, and the Type 99, of which roughly 53,000 were built. Both required 2-man crews and weighed more than the BAR, 19.2 pounds for the Type 96, 21.6 with a bipod for the Type 99. Both were manufactured to craft tolerances in small workshops by skilled metal workers who hand-fitted individual components and spent weeks on a single weapon. A manufacturing approach that produced excellent individual examples and could never scale to the volume modern infantry combat actually required. The Type 96 and Type 99 were not bad weapons by the technical standards of the era. Japanese ordnance engineers had incorporated genuine refinements, including a quick-change barrel system and a bayonet lug that reflected the same doctrinal assumptions governing the rest of Japanese infantry equipment. the expectation that even a crew-served automatic weapon might ultimately be employed in close combat. The problem was never the individual weapon's design quality. It was the organizational role Japanese doctrine assigned to it. The deeper problem was not production capacity. It was the same doctrinal frame already at work in the 1909 manual. Automatic weapons were organized as centralized support assets, not as something an individual squad carried by default. Japanese light machine guns were distributed at 2 or 3 per company, deployed deliberately by a company commander rather than issued downward as routine equipment. This gap would prove catastrophic in a specific, measurable way. A Japanese rifle squad of 13 men, armed with bolt-action Arisaka rifles, could theoretically deliver 65 aimed rounds per minute in trained hands. A Marine squad carrying 3 BARs, the standard allocation by 1943, could deliver roughly 150 rounds in the first 4 seconds of contact, before a Japanese rifleman who had fired his first shot could work his bolt for a second. August 21, 1942. The Battle of the Tenaru, more precisely the Ilu River, on Guadalcanal provided the first large-scale demonstration of what this arithmetic meant in practice. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki led 917 men in a night assault against Marine positions, expecting to close to bayonet range and overrun the defenders through exactly the spiritual and close combat superiority the 1909 manual promised. Ichiki had reason for confidence beyond doctrine alone. His force had been the spearhead of operations that had succeeded against far larger Chinese formations earlier in the war, and the intelligence available to him characterized the American defenders as recently landed, inexperienced, and unlikely to hold under a determined night assault delivered with the violence Japanese infantry tactics specified. Instead, the attacking column ran into interlocking automatic weapons fire that included BARs distributed throughout the Marine line. Private First Class Albert Schmidt, manning a machine gun that night, became one of the engagement's most decorated participants. He continued firing after a Japanese grenade fragment blinded him, directing his fire by sound and by the verbal corrections of the gunner beside him until the position held. But the position held through the combined effect of every automatic weapon in the line, including a dozen BARs in the rifle companies, firing in disciplined, controlled bursts. Schmidt's Pacific action became one of the most widely publicized individual stories of the early Pacific War, and it illustrates a pattern that would recur across every subsequent battle. The individual heroics that made the newspapers back home were generally inseparable from and dependent on the broader firepower density that the heroics alone could not have produced. Marine BAR gunners had been trained to fire in roughly 6-round bursts, about 1 second of sustained fire, then shift position immediately. Japanese soldiers charging toward the muzzle flash they had located in the dark frequently arrived to find empty ground. The gunner had already moved. Of Ichiki's original 917 men, 128 survived the assault. Ichiki himself died in the action, by most accounts, by his own hand, rather than accept the failure of an assault built on premises he had never had reason to doubt before that night. By late 1943, the Japanese response to this pattern of losses was to go underground. Elaborate cave and tunnel networks, not improvised holes, but engineered fortifications, with multiple connected chambers and interlocking fields of fire, became the architectural foundation of Japanese island defense, treated by Japanese commanders as effectively impregnable to anything short of massed artillery or a costly direct assault. These cave systems represented a genuine, sophisticated engineering response to the lessons of Guadalcanal, and deserve to be understood as such rather than dismissed as simple holes in volcanic rock. Japanese engineers designed multi-chamber positions with separate firing apertures oriented to cover different approach angles, ventilation shafts to manage the heat and smoke of sustained fighting inside an enclosed space, and connecting tunnels that allowed defenders to relocate between firing positions without exposing themselves on the surface at all. On Iwo Jima specifically, some positions extended 75 feet below the surface, connected to the broader 11-mile tunnel network by passages wide enough for ammunition resupply to move forward without daylight exposure. This was not improvisation under pressure. It was deliberate fortification engineering, applied at a scale and sophistication that matched anything in the European theater's static defensive lines. If you're finding this kind of detail valuable, the engineering and production realities underneath the battle narratives most documentaries skip past, a subscribe and a like genuinely helps this material reach more viewers. The BAR changed the calculation against even this level of engineering specifically because of a physical property of its ammunition that had nothing to do with doctrine on either side. The .30-06 round maintained lethal velocity through multiple ricochets inside an enclosed space. Marines at Tarawa, encountering the first sophisticated Japanese cave defenses on November 22, 1943, developed a technique that became standard procedure across the Pacific. Approach a cave entrance from an oblique angle, position the BAR gunner roughly 25 yards back, and fire a full 20-round magazine into the opening in a sweeping figure-8 pattern. A single magazine fired this way filled the entire interior chamber with bullets ricocheting unpredictably off rock walls, ceiling, and floor, an effect Marines came to call the Hornet's Nest. Japanese soldiers who had trained specifically to hold these positions to the death discovered that death arrived before they ever identified a target to shoot back at. The production numbers behind this capability were, by any standard available to Japanese planners in 1943, simply outside the range of what they believed possible from an opposing economy. The New England Small Arms Corporation manufactured approximately 168,380 BARs during the war. IBM, a company the Japanese military knew, if at all, as a manufacturer of business machines and typewriters, retooled its Poughkeepsie, New York plant in 1941 and had produced 20,000 BARs by 1944, each tested to tolerances tighter than anything Japanese hand-fitting could reliably reproduce at scale. Marlin Rockwell Corporation, which had limited prior weapons manufacturing experience, built dedicated new production facilities specifically for the contract. Total wartime BAR production across all manufacturers reached approximately 350,000 units, nearly 4 times Japan's combined production of the Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns together. What makes the IBM case specifically instructive is the speed of the conversion. A company whose entire pre-war manufacturing competency lay in precision mechanical calculation, punch card tabulators, typewriters, adding machines, reoriented a portion of its industrial base to firearms production within months, drawing on the same tolerance control disciplines and assembly line organization that built its civilian products. This kind of cross-sector industrial flexibility, a calculator manufacturer becoming a weapons manufacturer essentially overnight, without losing quality control, had no equivalent anywhere in Japan's more rigidly specialized wartime industrial base. Carl Gustaf's Stadsgevärsfaktori, the Swedish arms manufacturer, had licensed BAR production and reportedly explored selling units to Japan through neutral channels in 1943. Japan's military attaché in Stockholm investigated the possibility. Japan lacked both the foreign currency reserves and the shipping capacity to make the purchase viable, even had Sweden been willing to proceed. A logistical dead end that illustrates how completely Japan's wartime economy had been sealed off from the kind of industrial substitution that might have closed even part of the gap. Each BAR cost roughly $75 to manufacture in 1944. The Type 96 cost Japan significantly more in materials and skilled labor while delivering a heavier, slower, less reliable weapon. The metallurgy alone explains much of the difference. BAR barrels used chrome molybdenum steel that could sustain prolonged automatic fire without warping. Japanese machine gun barrels used lower-grade steel requiring careful, time-intensive heat treatment by trained craftsmen, a process that could produce a few hundred excellent barrels a month, not the tens of thousands American factories were turning out continuously. June 15, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded roughly 31,000 defenders who had spent months studying the lessons of Tarawa and Kwajalein and preparing accordingly. For everything, it turned out, except the sheer increase in automatic weapons density the Marines brought ashore. The Japanese garrison on Saipan had genuine advantages the earlier island battles had not provided. Volcanic terrain offering natural cave systems rather than purely engineered fortifications. A substantial civilian population that complicated American targeting decisions, and a full year of additional preparation time compared to the rushed defenses at Tarawa. Saito's own after-action assessments, recovered from captured documents, show a commander who had genuinely absorbed the tactical lessons of the preceding 18 months. Fields of fire interlocked correctly, reserve positions sited to support rather than simply reinforce the front line. Ammunition and water caches distributed to sustain a protracted defense rather than concentrated for a single decisive engagement. The defense was, by any reasonable military assessment, substantially more sophisticated than what Japan had fielded at Tarawa. By Saipan, Marine doctrine had evolved the BAR's organizational role further still. Official allocation had risen to 1 BAR per 4 Marines. Unofficially, squads scavenged additional weapons whenever supply allowed, and some operated with 5 or 6 BARs, functionally converting an infantry squad into a mobile automatic weapons platform. At the Battle of Purple Heart Ridge, Japanese defenders had built mutually supporting positions inside coral limestone caves, specifically designed so that no single position could be flanked in isolation. Private First Class Harold Agerholm earned a posthumous Medal of Honor at Saipan for evacuating 45 wounded Marines under fire, the kind of sustained casualty clearing effort that allowed BAR teams elsewhere on the line to remain in position and keep delivering suppressive fire, rather than withdrawing to manage their own wounded. The 2nd Marine Division alone fired 8.7 million rounds of .30 caliber ammunition in 3 weeks on Saipan, the overwhelming majority of it through BARs and machine guns. Japanese commanders who had planned to trade lives at favorable ratios through defensive terrain advantage and spiritual resolve instead confronted a straightforward arithmetic problem. American industrial production could supply more bullets indefinitely than Japan could supply soldiers to absorb them. Saito's improved tactical preparation had raised the cost of the American victory measurably above Tarawa's. It had not changed the outcome because the underlying production and doctrinal gap that Tarawa exposed was structural rather than tactical, and no improvement in Japanese field fortification, however genuine, addressed the structural problem directly. The psychological dimension compounded the physical one. Veterans on both sides described the BAR's distinctive rapid, percussive report, different in character from a belt-fed machine gun's sustained drone, as a sound that specifically announced mobile, hunting firepower, rather than a fixed defensive position that might eventually be flanked or outlasted. American fire discipline sharpened the effect further. Marine training emphasized short, controlled, aimed bursts rather than continuous, wasteful fire, which meant Japanese soldiers who had braced for inaccurate American spray instead encountered precise, repeatable killing. One captured Japanese training memorandum, recovered after Saipan and translated by Marine intelligence, instructed defenders to watch for the soldier who moved most frequently within an advancing squad and to fire on him first. The instruction was tactically sound and operationally useless. In a squad where every man carried a BAR's twin, distinguishing the automatic rifleman from anyone else moving through the same terrain required information the defender rarely had time to gather before the position was already under fire. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding roughly 21,000 defenders, had now had 3 years of accumulated Pacific battle reports to study, and had built the most sophisticated defense in depth the Japanese army would field anywhere in the war. 11 miles of interconnected tunnel network, engineered specifically to survive the bombardment and frontal assault patterns of every previous American landing. Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy represented a more fundamental doctrinal break from the 1909 manual than anything attempted at Saipan. He had explicitly forbidden the mass banzai charges that had characterized, and squandered, Japanese manpower at earlier battles, recognizing correctly that such assaults played directly into the automatic weapons density American forces now brought to every landing. His written orders to the garrison specified that every soldier was to kill 10 Americans before dying, a reorientation away from spiritual victory through decisive charge and towards something closer to a calculated attrition strategy. This was, in its way, an acknowledgement that the Seishin Doctrine's central premise had failed empirically, and yet the orders still assumed Japanese soldiers would ultimately die in place rather than retreat, preserving the doctrine's fatalism even after abandoning its tactical method. Marine BAR tactics had continued evolving in parallel. BAR up front had become standard doctrine. The automatic rifleman led an advance, suppressing a position while riflemen maneuvered around it, converting a weapon that had served a primarily defensive role in the First World War into the spearhead of offensive small unit movement. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, who had become the most famous BAR and machine gun operator of the Pacific War after repelling roughly 3,000 attacking Japanese soldiers at Guadalcanal in October 1942, was killed by mortar fire on Iwo Jima's first day, leading his machine gun sections forward, having survived some of the most intense combat sequences of the entire war, only to fall in its opening hours. Of Iwo Jima's roughly 21,000-man garrison, only 1,083 were taken prisoner. The rest died in place, a substantial number of them sealed inside collapsed cave positions by sustained automatic weapons fire. Marines expended an estimated 12 million rounds of small arms ammunition across 36 days of fighting. The 28th Marine Regiment alone, assaulting Mount Suribachi, fired through approximately 90,000 rounds of BAR ammunition in 5 days. April 1st, 1945, Okinawa, the final and largest Pacific land battle against the Japanese 32nd Army's roughly 130,000 defenders, including conscripted Okinawan civilians. By Okinawa, American BAR production had passed 300,000 units, and the official allocation ratio had effectively become a formality. Some Army units abandoned outright. The 96th Infantry Division reported carrying substantially more BARs than its authorized table of organization specified, because soldiers in the field had independently concluded, unit by unit, that survival correlated directly with carried firepower, regardless of what the paperwork allowed. This kind of informal, bottom-up reallocation, squads and platoons exceeding their official equipment authorization without waiting for doctrine to catch up, itself reflects an institutional flexibility within the American supply system that the rigid, centralized allocation governing Japanese automatic weapons could not match even in principle. There was, organizationally, no equivalent mechanism by which a Japanese platoon leader could simply acquire additional Type 96s beyond what regimental headquarters had authorized. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, senior staff officer of the Japanese 32nd Army and one of the few senior officers to survive the campaign, wrote extensively after the war about the scale of American material superiority he had personally witnessed. His specific writings do not appear, in available English translations, to single out the BAR by name, but the broader pattern he described, American firepower density that Japanese defensive doctrine had no mechanism to counter, matches precisely what the unit-level statistics from the campaign show. Yahara had argued, before the battle began, against the aggressive counterattack strategy that General Mitsuru Ushijima's staff ultimately favored, advocating instead for a purely passive defense in depth that would maximize American casualties while minimizing Japanese exposure to exactly the kind of automatic weapons fire that had proven so costly at Saipan and Iwo Jima. His argument was overruled, and the resulting counterattacks in the battle's early weeks produced Japanese casualty rates even more severe than the cave-clearing operations that followed. The Shuri defensive line, the Japanese 32nd Army's primary fortified position, did not fall to a single massed assault. It fell to the methodical, cave-by-cave, position-by-position application of automatic weapons fire, repeated for weeks. The U.S. 10th Army fired an estimated 60 million rounds of small arms ammunition across 82 days on Okinawa. The 24th Corps alone documented 25 million rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition expended. A surviving company log from the 32nd Army's 24th Division, recovered after the battle, records its ammunition resupply request for the final week of organized resistance. Enough small arms rounds, by the quartermaster's own arithmetic, to sustain roughly 4 minutes of an American BAR team's typical sustained fire rate. General Ushijima committed ritual suicide on June 22, 1945, as organized resistance collapsed, having presided over the destruction of the largest single Japanese army formation lost in the entire Pacific War. The training investment behind this firepower advantage was, in its own way, as industrially organized as the manufacturing that produced the weapons. Before addressing that training pipeline directly, it is worth stating plainly what the Japanese soldier brought to these engagements that the production statistics alone do not capture. Post-war American assessments, including detailed studies conducted by the Army's own historical division in the late 1940s, consistently rated individual Japanese infantry skill, marksmanship, fieldcraft, camouflage discipline, and the physical endurance to hold a concealed position for extended periods without movement as fully comparable to American infantry, and in some specific categories, superior. The defeat documented across these 5 battles was not a defeat of Japanese soldiers by better American soldiers. American after-action reports from Peleliu, fought between Saipan and Iwo Jima, specifically praised the discipline and patience of Japanese defenders who held fire for extended periods, rather than revealing a position prematurely. Exactly the kind of individual battlefield skill that has nothing to do with industrial capacity. What these same reports also documented, repeatedly and without exception, was that this individual skill bought time rather than survival. A well-concealed Japanese rifleman with excellent fire discipline could delay an American advance, inflict real casualties, and hold a position far longer than a poorly trained soldier could have managed. He could not, by any combination of personal skill, change the arithmetic once his position was identified and a BAR team brought its weapon to bear on it. The individual contest, where it existed, was frequently close to even. The systemic contest behind it was not, and the systemic contest is what actually determined casualty ratios across the war as a whole. At Camp Pendleton and Fort Benning, The standard BAR qualification course required each Marine or soldier to fire a minimum of 2,000 rounds across a structured progression of drills: instinctive shooting without deliberate aim, walking fire onto a moving impact point, alternating fire between paired BAR teams, and magazine changes drilled until a trained gunner could swap a magazine in under 3 seconds and clear a field-level stoppage without conscious thought. By graduation, the technique had become reflexive rather than deliberate, a degree of individual ammunition expenditure in training alone that exceeded what many Japanese infantrymen fired in their entire prior service. Japanese soldiers frequently entered combat having fired fewer than 100 rounds during training, a direct consequence of an ammunition economy that could not subsidize extensive live-fire rehearsal on top of combat consumption. This disparity compounded across the length of the war in a way that a single million across 36 days. At Okinawa, an estimated 60 million across 82 days. Japanese military deaths across the entire Pacific War reach approximately 2.3 million by post-war Japanese government accounting, of which Japanese historical research attributes roughly 60%, some 1.4 million, to starvation and disease rather than direct combat, with the remaining combat deaths on the order of 900,000 attributable to the full combination of artillery, air power, naval gunfire, and small arms fire across every theater and campaign. Japanese forces, for their part, killed approximately 111,000 Americans across the entire Pacific War from all causes combined, a disparity exceeding 20 to 1. No single weapon produced that ratio. The BAR was one component within a larger system of artillery coordination, naval gunfire support, air interdiction, and logistics that together constituted American material superiority in the Pacific. What the BAR demonstrates with unusual clarity, because its production numbers, ammunition consumption, and tactical employment are so thoroughly documented, is the specific mechanism by which that broader superiority translated into outcomes at the level of a single squad clearing a single cave. Not better marksmanship, not greater individual courage on either side, but an industrial and doctrinal capacity to put sustained, redundant automatic fire into the hands of ordinary infantrymen at a density Japan's economy, manufacturing methods, and tactical doctrine had no mechanism to match or counter. The progression across the 5 battles is itself instructive because it shows Japanese commanders genuinely learning and adapting at the tactical level. Saito's improved field fortifications at Saipan, Kuribayashi's abandonment of the mass banzai charge at Iwo Jima, Yahara's advocacy for pure passive defense at Okinawa. While the underlying structural gap in automatic weapons density and ammunition supply remained completely unaddressed across all 3 adaptations. Each Japanese commander identified real, specific tactical lessons from the battle before his own and applied them correctly. None of those lessons touched the production and doctrinal gap that Tarawa had already exposed in November 1943, because that gap was not a tactical problem any single commander in the field had the authority or resources to solve. It required a different industrial base, a different ammunition economy, and a different peacetime institutional history. 3 decades of decisions made well before any comparison of unit firepower does not capture. An American replacement arriving in the Pacific in 1944 had typically fired more live rounds in stateside training than most Japanese veterans had fired across years of actual combat service. The skill gap this produced was not primarily about marksmanship in the traditional sense. Japanese riflemen were, individually, frequently excellent shots, a point American after-action reports conceded repeatedly. It was about the specific, narrower skill of operating an automatic weapon under stress without conscious deliberation, clearing a jam by feel in the dark, judging burst length by the changing weight of the weapon as the magazine emptied, recognizing the specific click and resistance that preceded a stoppage before it fully occurred. These were motor skills built through repetition at a volume Japan's wartime ammunition economy could not support for its infantry training pipeline, regardless of how much individual aptitude or determination a given recruit brought to the course. If accounts like this one, the production numbers and doctrinal decisions that actually decided Pacific battles, beneath the individual heroics that usually get the screen time, are worth your attention, subscribing and leaving a like helps this kind of detail reach more people. This training approach reflected something specific about how each military culture related to the weapon itself, beyond simple resource availability. Japanese soldiers were trained to regard the rifle as something closer to a sacred object. an extension in the era's official rhetoric of the emperor's will, to be maintained with corresponding reverence. American Marines were trained to regard the BAR as a tool, reliable, interchangeable, and disposable in the specific sense that a malfunctioning weapon was simply exchanged for another from supply, rather than repaired under fire at personal risk. Neither attitude was irrational given each army's actual resupply capacity. Each was also, separately, a direct consequence of it. The aggregate numbers, assembled across the 5 major battles, describe an asymmetry that no single tactical adjustment on the Japanese side could have closed. Total wartime BAR production, approximately 350,000 units, against Japan's combined Type 96 and Type 99 light machine gun production of roughly 94,000, a ratio of nearly 4-to-1 in raw automatic weapon numbers alone, before accounting for ammunition supply, training depth, or organizational distribution down to the individual squad. Rounds expended at Tarawa numbered in the low millions across 76 hours. At Saipan, 8.7 million from a single division in 3 weeks. At Iwo Jima, an estimated 12 of these men commanded a Pacific garrison. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who had commanded Japanese forces through both the conquest of Singapore and the collapse in the Philippines before his post-war execution for war crimes, reflected before his death on having fundamentally misjudged the character of the war Japan had entered. His own campaign record encompassed both extremes of the war's trajectory: a stunningly rapid victory over numerically superior British and Commonwealth forces in Malaya in early 1942, achieved through exactly the aggressive infantry tactics the 1909 manual prescribed, and then total defeat in the Philippines 3 years later against an American force whose firepower density bore no resemblance to what the doctrine had prepared him to expect. Yamashita's own post-war reflections suggest he understood the irony directly. The same tactical approach that had won Malaya in weeks had become a liability against an opponent whose automatic weapons doctrine had developed specifically in response to the kind of warfare Japan's earlier victories had not anticipated. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the war, wrote afterward that American strength had never rested on individual superiority, but on the systematic application of industrial capacity to warfare. Every rifle, in his framing, the visible output of an entire mobilized economy operating behind it. Fuchida's post-war trajectory included a period studying American military production methods directly, an experience he described as clarifying, for the first time, the actual scale of the mismatch his country had entered into in 1941 with what amounted to incomplete information about its opponent's industrial reserves. If this account gave you something to think about, the production numbers and doctrinal choices that decided outcomes long before any individual soldier reached the battlefield, hit the like button and subscribe. It helps this kind of detailed history reach the people who want the complete picture, not just the version that fits in a highlight reel. The cave entrances scattered across Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa still carry the physical marks of this asymmetry today. Pockmarked rock surfaces where ricocheting .30-06 rounds struck repeatedly inside enclosed spaces designed, by their Japanese builders, to be unapproachable from the front. Post-war archaeological and battlefield preservation surveys on several of these islands have documented the bullet scarring pattern as a distinct, recognizable signature, distinguishable from artillery or naval gunfire damage by the specific multi-angle striking pattern that only sustained automatic rifle fire into a confined space produces. Hawkins did not survive Tarawa. He was killed 2 days after the action that opened this account, having refused evacuation for an earlier wound in order to keep leading his platoon forward. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The weapon he carried that morning was not by itself the reason for the outcome on that beach or any of the islands that followed it. It was simply the point at which an entire mismatched industrial and doctrinal contest became visible, for a few seconds at a time, in the hands of a single man, repeated, with variations in name and island and date, several thousand times more before the war's last organized Japanese resistance ended in the summer of 1945.